Zanab had always been the kind of wife who put her heart into her marriage. She showed David love in every way she knew, cooking his favorite meals, planning thoughtful surprises, and always being there when he needed support. Yet, despite her efforts, something began to shift in their relationship. The deep insecurities that had haunted Zanab from past relationships started to creep into her mind. She began to question David's actions, doubting his loyalty even when he was doing nothing wrong. Every time he was late from work or received a message on his phone, her anxiety flared. What was once a peaceful and loving marriage slowly turned into an environment of suspicion and unease. David, who had always loved Zanab deeply, found himself tiptoeing around her, unsure of what might trigger another accusation. It wasn't that he had changed, but the weight of Zanab's insecurities became a constant presence in their lives, creating a divide that seemed impossible to bridge. Zanab's insecurity wasn't something that appeared overnight. It was the result of years of emotional wounds left by previous relationships, where she had been hurt and betrayed by men she once trusted. Each betrayal left a scar, and instead of healing, she carried those scars into her marriage with David. In her heart, she knew that David was different from the others, but the fear of being hurt again was so strong that it overshadowed her rational thoughts. She became hypervigilant, constantly checking for signs of infidelity where none existed. Her mind, clouded by past trauma, convinced her that David would eventually hurt her too, just like the others. She would go through his phone, looking for anything suspicious, and whenever David had a late night at work, she would bombard him with questions. No amount of reassurance from David could quiet the storm in her mind. Over time, her fears became overwhelming, transforming her loving nature into a source of tension and conflict. One sleepless night, as Zanab lay in bed, her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't control. David was sleeping peacefully beside her, completely unaware of the turmoil she was experiencing. She tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her thoughts fixated on David's phone, sitting on the nightstand, just within reach. Against her better judgment, she picked it up, her heart pounding in her chest as she unlocked it. Scrolling through his messages, she came across one that made her blood run cold. It was from a woman named Christabel. The message read, "David, thank you so much for being there for me. I finally got the good news, I'm pregnant. I can't wait to tell my husband." Zanab's mind instantly jumped to the worst possible conclusion. She was convinced that Christabel was pregnant with David's child. Her hands shook as she put the phone down, her mind spiraling into a frenzy of imagined betrayal. The discovery of the message from Christabel sent Zanab into a downward spiral of paranoia and despair. Her mind became a whirlwind of dark thoughts, convinced that David had been unfaithful to her with this woman. She couldn't shake the image of David and Christabel together, her imagination running wild with scenarios that never happened. She pictured David sneaking around behind her back, hiding his affair while pretending to be the loving husband she thought she knew. Every kind word or gesture David had ever shown her suddenly felt like a lie. Zanab's heart was heavy with a mix of rage and sorrow, and she couldn't bear to stay silent. The betrayal she imagined felt so real that it consumed her, leaving no room for doubt. She became obsessed with the idea that David had been unfaithful, and nothing could convince her otherwise. Zanab's world was crumbling, and she was determined to confront David about what she believed was the ultimate betrayal. The next morning, unable to hold back her emotions any longer, Zanab confronted David with all the pent-up anger and hurt she had been harboring. She stormed into the kitchen where he was preparing breakfast and, without warning, unleashed her fury. "How could you do this to me, David? Is this why you've been so distant? You got another woman pregnant," she shouted, her voice trembling with emotion. David, caught off guard, looked at her in shock. He had no idea what she was talking about. He had just woken up and hadn't even had time to gather his thoughts before being accused of something so terrible. But as Zanab continued to rant and throw accusations at him, David felt a familiar weariness wash over him. He had been through this so many times before, always defending himself, always trying to prove his innocence. This time, however, he couldn't find the energy to argue. He simply snubbed her, grabbed his things, and left for work without another word. Left alone in the house, Zanab's anger only intensified. She couldn't believe that David had walked out on her without even defending himself. To her, his silence was an admission of guilt. Her mind twisted this into evidence that he was planning to leave her for Christabel. She became consumed by her emotions, unable to see the situation clearly. In her mind, everything pointed to betrayal. Zanab's fear of losing David and the overwhelming sense of insecurity pushed her to do something desperate. She reached out to Angela, a mutual acquaintance who had always been eager to stir up trouble. Zanab, driven by her need to punish David for what she believed he had done, convinced Angela to help her frame David for a crime. Angela, who was in need of money and always looking for an opportunity, agreed to Zanab's plan. Together, they devised a scheme to accuse David of rape, knowing full well the devastating consequences this could have on his life. The plan Zanab and Angela concocted quickly spiraled out of control. Angela went to the police and reported that David had raped her, providing a fabricated story that painted him as the villain. The police, taking the allegations seriously, wasted no time in arresting David. Zanab, consumed by her own misguided conviction that David had been unfaithful, stood by Angela's side as she testified against her husband. The case quickly gained attention, and soon, the media was reporting on it, turning David's life into a public spectacle. In court, Zanab took the stand, her heart hardened by the belief that she was right. She testified against the man she had once loved, convinced that he deserved to be punished. Angela, playing her role to perfection, also testified, further cementing David's fate. David, on the other hand, was too heartbroken and confused to fight back effectively. The weight of the false accusations and the betrayal of his wife left him speechless and devastated. The trial ended with a guilty verdict, and David was sentenced to several years in prison. As the judge delivered the sentence, David stood there, numb with disbelief. He couldn't comprehend how his life had spiraled so far out of control. The woman he had loved, the woman he had married, had turned against him in the most unimaginable way. As the gavel struck and the courtroom emptied, David was led away in handcuffs, his mind still reeling from the events that had unfolded. Every day in prison was a painful reminder of the betrayal he had suffered. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, trying to understand how Zanab could have believed something so far from the truth. The love they had once shared was now buried under layers of lies, mistrust, and pain. David's life as he knew it was over, and all he could do was try to survive the nightmare that had become his reality. Months passed, and as Zanab went about her daily life, the weight of what she had done began to press down on her. She had achieved her goal of punishing David, but instead of feeling satisfaction, she felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. The anger that had fueled her actions slowly dissipated, leaving behind only regret. One day, unable to shake the nagging feeling that she had made a terrible mistake, Zanab decided to go through David's phone once more. This time, instead of just skimming through the messages, she took the time to read the entire conversation between David and Christabel. As she read through the messages, her heart sank. Christabel wasn't David's lover, she was simply a friend who had been going through a difficult time. The message that had sent Zanab into a frenzy was nothing more than a thank you note for David's support during Christabel's journey to motherhood with her own husband. There had been no affair, no betrayal, only an innocent friendship that Zanab had completely misunderstood. Zanab collapsed onto the floor, her body shaking with sobs as the realization of what she had done washed over her. She had destroyed her marriage, ruined David's life, and sent an innocent man to prison, all because of her insecurities and her inability to trust. The guilt was overwhelming, crushing her under its weight as she replayed the events in her mind. How could she have been so blind? How could she have let her fears drive her to such extreme actions? Zanab desperately tried to undo the damage she had caused. She contacted lawyers, sought out legal advice, and did everything in her power to see if David could be bailed out. But it was too late. The legal system had already run its course, and there was nothing more she could do. The damage was done, and she had no choice but to live with the consequences of her actions. Zanab's world crumbled around her as she realized that she had lost everything she had ever cared about. Zanab collapsed onto the cold, hard floor, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. The weight of her actions pressed down on her chest, suffocating her with regret. She could barely breathe as the realization of what she had done sank in. David, the man who had loved her despite everything, was sitting in a prison cell because of her insecurities. She had destroyed not only their marriage but his entire life. Her mind raced as she desperately tried to think of a way to fix what she had broken. She contacted lawyers, pleaded with the authorities, and even tried to find Angela to convince her to retract her false testimony. But it was too late. The wheels of justice had already turned, and David was paying the price for her mistake. The damage was irreversible. Zanab had no choice but to live with the consequences of her actions, haunted by the ruin she had caused. Each day became a relentless nightmare for Zanab. Guilt gnawed at her soul, an inescapable torment that followed her everywhere. She could no longer look at herself in the mirror without seeing the face of a woman who had destroyed the one person who truly loved her. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, was now a cold, empty shell, echoing with the memories of a happier time. Zanab avoided her friends, ashamed to face them, knowing they would see through her facade. She couldn't escape the overwhelming regret that consumed her every waking moment. Her thoughts circled endlessly around what she had done, and the price David was paying for her fears. The life she had built was in ruins, and the man she had vowed to love and protect was suffering because of her betrayal. Zanab realized too late that her insecurities had cost her everything, leaving her with nothing but sorrow and regret. After years of suffering, David was finally released from prison, but he was no longer the same man who had entered. The world had moved on without him, and he found himself in an unfamiliar place, both emotionally and physically. The time behind bars had scarred him deeply, stripping him of his optimism and trust. Yet, despite the pain and betrayal he had endured, David was determined not to let his past define his future. He threw himself into work, taking on any job he could find, rebuilding his life one piece at a time. His once vibrant spirit was now subdued, but a quiet resilience burned within him. David knew that healing would take time, but he refused to let Zanab's actions destroy him completely. He was a broken man, but he was not defeated. With each passing day, he worked towards reclaiming the life he had lost, slowly stitching together the remnants of his shattered world. Zanab, consumed by guilt and regret, tried desperately to reach out to David after his release. She called him repeatedly, left messages, and even showed up at his new job, hoping for a chance to beg for his forgiveness. But David couldn't bring himself to face her. To him, their marriage had ended the moment she stood in court and testified against him. The woman he had once loved had betrayed him in the worst way imaginable, and no amount of apologies could erase the pain she had caused. David told Zanab that he had moved on, that there was no place for her in his life anymore. He had spent years suffering for a crime he didn't commit, and now, all he wanted was to leave the past behind. He made it clear that he had no intention of rekindling their relationship, leaving Zanab to confront the reality of the irreversible damage she had caused. As time passed, David slowly began to heal. Though the scars of betrayal remained, he found solace in the company of a kind and understanding woman named Fatima. She was everything Zanab wasn't: loving, patient, and most importantly, trusting. Fatima accepted David for who he was, never questioning his loyalty or intentions. With her by his side, David rediscovered the happiness he thought he had lost forever. Their relationship blossomed into a love built on mutual respect and trust, qualities that had been missing in his previous marriage. Eventually, David and Fatima got married and started a family of their own, welcoming 2 beautiful children into their lives. The joy and purpose that his new family brought him helped David leave the past behind. He no longer thought of Zanab or the pain she had caused, choosing instead to focus on the present and the future with Fatima. In her, he had found the peace and love he had always deserved. While David found happiness in his new life, Zanab remained trapped in the prison of her own making. The regret of her actions weighed heavily on her every day, a constant reminder of the love she had destroyed. She couldn't escape the memories of what could have been if she had only trusted David. The loneliness that followed was suffocating, but Zanab knew she had no one to blame but herself. She spent countless nights replaying the events that had led to her downfall, wishing she could turn back time and make different choices. But time moved forward, and Zanab was left to live with the consequences of her actions. Her once happy marriage had crumbled because of her insecurities, and now she faced a future filled with nothing but regret. The years of loneliness became a fitting punishment, a constant reminder of the love she had lost because she couldn't let go of her fears and trust the man she loved. Zanab watched from afar as David built a new life, one that was filled with the happiness she had once dreamed of. Seeing him with his new wife, Fatima, and their children was a bitter reminder of the life she could have had if she hadn't let her insecurities get the best of her. Zanab tried to move on, but no matter how hard she tried, the weight of her guilt kept her anchored to the past. She couldn't bring herself to remarry, unable to trust herself or anyone else again. Every day was a reminder of the consequences of her mistrust. She saw the love and joy that David had found with Fatima, and it only deepened her regret. Zanab had thrown away a good man because of her unfounded fears, and now she was paying the price. Her life had become a shadow of what it once was, haunted by the love she had lost forever.